In this segment of Comparing Confucius, it is time to look at the weaknesses of Confucius, but they have to be understood in the background of the tremendous success. Confucianism, as the core of Chinese traditional thought, propelled the Chinese into the longest continuous economic and political success on the globe. It is true there were periods of disorder between dynasties, but these were comparatively short, and they were marked on the other side by periods of 200 and 300 and 400 years of continuous governmental stability under a single dynasty. Their economic progress was also remarkable. Overall, they produced the largest population because they could feed that population. And they could feed that population and have a surplus that allowed them to manufacture some of those fantastically beautiful art, the major silk producers, the major porcelain producers for the globe for a couple of thousand years. Parts of the Confucian thought process operate. And here's one quote that signals Chinese success. This is from the Analects. Let the producers be many and the consumers few. Let there be activity in the production and economy in the expenditure. Then the wealth will always be sufficient. Now this kind of quotation, as the center of Chinese traditional thought, spreads through the entire population. So everyone in the country, for the emperor, to his ministers, to the husbands, to the wives, to the older brothers, to the younger brothers, everybody sees that the critical economic activity should be that there is activity in production and economy and expenditure. And while not every person followed it, if you have an idea like that that spreads across a very large population of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, you're going to get economic success. And I believe this aphorism continues to be one of the core aphorisms that motivates Chinese society today, and that provides an explanation as to why now they have been able to produce an increase in their GDP, their total economic wealth, at a rate of about 10% a year for nearly 30 years. And even today, when they are one of the largest economies in the world, they're able to expand by as much as 8 or 9%. In contrast, the American society has moved along at 4% in a good year, and often years that are 2 or 3%. So Chinese traditional thought can be very successful. Having said that, are there any weaknesses? And there's almost no cultural system that is not prone to certain weaknesses or certain disadvantageous behaviors. And the Confucian system does have them. And it flows out, again, of a focus on the common good. The common good tends to represent conformism. And if there's no self-correction, if the country takes a wrong turn and it hurtles down a wrong path, it can hurtle down that path very quickly and very destructively. Here we come to a critical contrast between the West. One of the characteristics of the Western commitment to individual rights is the notion that an individual has a right to express themselves. So free expression, or as it's often used, free speech, is a core part of Western thought. Not so for the Chinese. Free speech, freedom of expression, if unlimited, would mean that you could criticize the government. That would open up the possibility of rebellions against the government as a whole, against the central authority, or against the emperor, or in today's terms, against the critical leaders of the national government. And such, the Chinese believe, would promote Luan. And the opposition to that means that all speech is carefully controlled, not just by the government, but oftentimes by self-censorship on the part of the people. So there is a contrast between free expression in the West and no free expression in China. Why is this important? Well, this is important because the one great failing on a global scale over the last 2,000 years was that the Chinese, who invented half of all the inventions that have come about, were able to do so because the new inventions were not challenging anything old. But if there was a challenge to what was already an accepted practice, then the Chinese had trouble because you couldn't criticize it because there wasn't a tradition of free speech. And this became, and the West too had long periods of time when free speech was not respected. Think of those who tried to argue that the world was round or a globe, or those who argued that the globe that was the Earth was circulating around the sun rather than otherwise. These were silenced. The tragic case of Galileo comes to mind. But after Galileo, in the West, a tradition of free speech came about. And this free speech made possible the scientific revolution, the development of science, the development of the scientific method, a method for challenging existing truths and then testing them to see whether they're correct or not. The development of the scientific method in the West, when it failed to develop in the East, produced a great weakness for the Confucian system. This weakness became evident at a critical point in Chinese history. After 1800, the Qing dynasty, the ruling dynasty of China, was in a period of decline, a period in which decadence set in. The Chinese would not be surprised by this. They'd seen this happen to other dynasties, and they would have expected that dynasty to end and a new dynasty to come along and take its place. But what was wrong what became a problem for the Chinese is that people outside the Chinese world in the West had developed the scientific method, and with it quickly came the Industrial Revolution. And so China's new threat came from over the sea, from people who had ships, sometimes ironclad ships, often heavily armed with cannon. And the Chinese, although they'd invented gunpowder and cannons, had no comparable military force. And there was no easy way for them to challenge or develop it because of the lack of the scientific method. This led to weakness throughout the 18th century, and finally the collapse of the imperial system in 1912. The imperial system ended January 1, 1912, having essentially fallen apart in the closing days of 1911. This was, for the Chinese, a tremendous blow. What it meant was that the Chinese traditional system had shown critical flaws, and it had failed, and therefore the Confucian core was said to have failed. So the Chinese reacted rather badly to it. They reacted with a sense of a loss of confidence. This loss of confidence came at a critical point. They were threatened by the colonization of a variety of European powers, and they were threatened by colonization by a Confucian people who, although Confucian in their preparation, had enough distance from Confucianism to be able to adapt to Western conditions. So the threat to the Chinese, the greatest threat to the Chinese, came from the Japanese. The Japanese were Confucian, having adopted the Chinese written character system and having adopted Confucian ideas. But the Japanese were never so committed to Confucianism as the Chinese because it wasn't their invention. They had no reason to have a domestic pride in Confucianism. They could take Confucianism or leave it if Confucianism was not helpful. The Japanese threat throughout the first half of the 20th century was massive, and it was very expensive for the Chinese, and it weakened them very badly. This set the stage for the greatest challenge to Confucianism to develop. It developed as at the end of the Japanese War in 1945, a civil war between forces that sought somehow to save Chinese traditional civilization by making makeshift kinds of compromises. A government of the Chinese nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek faced a civil war led by Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. In that civil war, the Chinese Communist Party prevailed. The nationalists were forced to flee to the island of Formosa, now called the island of Taiwan, and the Chinese took over the mainland. what was this Maoist government? And I call it a Maoist government rather than calling it a communist government because I've become convinced, having looked at the records, that despite a kind of patina of Marxist-Leninist thought, in reality, the core of the Maoist regime was a Chinese traditional regime. It sought to declare that Confucianism was feudalism, that it was all in the past, that a great new day in which a new socialist man was going to be created was on its way. But in the end, Mao was only able to maintain his control if he was able to use essentially Chinese traditional techniques, including Confucius techniques, in order to maintain power. Strewn all through the great thoughts of Mao Zedong, and I don't think they're great thoughts, but strewn all through the so-called great thoughts of Mao Zedong are lines that could have been taken from Confucius. In fact, they call for a kind of revitalization of the Chinese spirit based on Confucian principles. It was, to be sure, an extreme regime, a regime which, in the process of trying to talk against Confucianism, had very bad principles. And if the lack of free speech is one of the weaknesses with Confucianism, the other weakness is that if they have a strong leader who leads in the wrong direction, the Chinese hurtle downward at a staggeringly fast pace. So Maoism was marked by the world's greatest famine of all time, bar none. A famine that killed between 20 and 60 million people between 1959 and 1961. Notice that the range, 20 million to 60 million people, is staggering. How come we don't know how many people died? We don't know how many people died because so many people died, there weren't people around to count the dead. We can only use kind of gross measures of how much we would expect the population to have expanded, and then to notice that its actual count is down from that, and that gives us this range. Maoism also led to political disorders in something called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution from 1966, in an intense phase until 1969, and in some calculations made by the Chinese, the Cultural Revolution lasted until 1976, until the death of Mao Zedong. Now, this period, marked by a kind of socialist rhetoric, was in fact not Marxist-Leninist. I think the leaders of the Soviet Union who condemned Mao for not being a Marxist-Leninist were in fact correct. Because Mao sought to make spirit and elan and following the great leader the key principle of his Maoist thought. And this sort of spiritual dimension flew in the face of the fundamental underlying dialectical materialism of Marxism. So in a very fundamental sense, what Mao did was not introduce Marxist-Leninism to China. Now that might sound like it's an apologist. If you look back at the Cold War rhetoric, it would seem like I'm defending the Chinese, saying that they were not enemies of the United States, and that's quite wrong. Under Mao, for most of the time, they were emphatically enemies of the United States. It's just that they weren't Marxist-Leninist enemies of the United States because they had abandoned that sort of thought. This period of Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought rule was very destructive to China. But it had at its core Confucian principles. And that brings us to one very critical reality. In fact, a very important reality for looking at the Confucian system. Once Mao died, Maoism died. And what were the Chinese left with? In very short order after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, China restored fundamental Chinese traditional thought with its Confucian core. And one of the most remarkable stories of cultural revitalization in the world is the revitalization of the Chinese traditional culture that came after the massive attack led by Mao Zedong, which will be the subject of the next segment in this course.